Seattle's rain fell in thin silver lines that blurred the city into a quiet watercolor. Through the fogged window of a modest apartment, Daniel Pierce sat at his desk, staring at a half-lit screen. The code he'd been working on for days no longer made sense. Lines of text, once alive with promise, now looked like the remains of a dream that had died quietly in his hands. The startup he had poured his savings and his soul into was crumbling. Investors had pulled out, debts had mounted, and his co-founder had already left town. Behind him, the faint sound of heels clicked across the wooden floor. Clara Reynolds, his wife, stood by the door, her arms crossed, a coat slung over her forearm. She looked immaculate as always. Her dark hair pulled back neatly, her perfume filling the room with the scent of expensive lilies. "You're still at it?" she asked softly, though her tone carried a fatigue that had become familiar. Daniel turned his chair slightly, forcing a smile. "Just trying to fix the back-end errors. If we can get the prototype running—" She interrupted with a sigh, eyes dropping to the cluttered desk. "You've been saying that for months. Daniel, we can't keep living like this. The rent's overdue again." Her voice didn't break, but the silence after it did. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her that he was close, that the app would work, that all the nights without sleep, the instant noodles, the second-hand furniture, would mean something soon. But he couldn't bring himself to lie anymore. "I just need more time," he said quietly. Clara's expression softened for a moment, but only a moment. Time doesn't pay bills or buy groceries. She walked past him, opening the window slightly as if to air out the staleness of their apartment and maybe their marriage. Outside, the city lights shimmered through the drizzle. They used to talk about buying a house one day, near the lake, with a garden. She used to laugh at his optimism, but she loved it too. Now that optimism felt like a childish indulgence she couldn't afford. When Daniel reached for her hand, she didn't pull away, but she didn't hold it either. "I'm doing this for us," he said. Clara looked at him then, her eyes filled with something between pity and exhaustion. "No, Daniel, you're doing this for you." That night, when she went to bed early, Daniel stayed awake until the first light crept across the floorboards. His computer fan hummed softly in the dark, a lullaby for a man who couldn't sleep because the dream he'd built was collapsing, and he didn't know how to stop it. Days turned into weeks. Daniel tried to find investors, pitching in coffee shops and cheap offices across the city, but his words began to sound hollow even to himself. The app, an AI-driven scheduling platform, was ahead of its time but lacked funding. Each rejection felt heavier. Meanwhile, Clara's world grew smaller. She stopped inviting friends over. She started working late at the interior design firm downtown. When Daniel asked how her day was, she'd answer with polite disinterest, scrolling through her phone as if searching for another version of her life. One night, she came home later than usual. Her makeup was perfect, her lipstick fresh, and Daniel could smell the faint scent of whiskey on her breath. "Were you at the office?" he asked. "Dinner with a client," she replied, avoiding his eyes. He nodded, pretending to believe her, pretending not to notice the shift, the emotional distance that widened like a crack in glass, spreading invisibly until everything fragile in their life was ready to shatter. The day it did finally break was an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel came home early from a meeting that had ended with yet another rejection. He opened the door and found Clara standing in the living room, a suitcase beside her. She didn't cry, neither did he. "I can't do this anymore," she said simply. Daniel stood there, soaked from the rain, his laptop bag still over his shoulder. "You're leaving?" "I already have," she answered, glancing at the suitcase. "I just came to say goodbye properly." "Is there someone else?" The words tasted like rust. Clara hesitated. Her silence was enough. Daniel let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and a sob. "So that's it? After everything, after all the promises?" Her eyes flickered with guilt, but she straightened her shoulders. I'm tired of waiting for a miracle, Daniel. I want a life that feels real. I deserve that. He wanted to shout that he had done everything for her, that every sleepless night and every failed pitch was an act of love. But all he said was, "Then I hope it's worth it." Clara stepped closer, her voice trembling for the first time. You're a good man, but love isn't enough when you're always drowning. Then she was gone. The door closed quietly, and the sound echoed through the small apartment, settling into the corners like dust. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she had stood, at the half-empty coffee mug she'd left on the counter. The rain outside grew heavier, blurring the world again. He turned to his computer screen. The code still waited there unfinished, stubborn, lifeless, just like him. That night he deleted everything. The startup files, the app's source code, the plans, the pitch decks. Gone. In the silence that followed, he realized that failure wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was the sound of a door closing softly behind the woman you loved, and the faint click of a mouse as you erase the only thing you thought made you worthy of her. The next morning, Daniel packed a single bag, left the apartment key on the table, and walked out into the cold Seattle air. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. The rain met his face like an old friend, washing the last trace of warmth from his skin. He walked until the streets blurred and the city no longer felt like his. And somewhere between one breath and the next, Daniel Pierce, once a dreamer, once a husband, disappeared into the rain, leaving behind nothing but unfinished lines of code and a love story that had ended quietly, like the closing of a book no one ever finished reading. The wedding had been everything Clara Reynolds once thought she wanted. A ballroom glittering with chandeliers, champagne bubbling like laughter, cameras flashing against her diamond-studded smile. Ethan Wallace had slipped a platinum ring onto her finger and promised her a life of stability, of ease, of elegance. And for a while, that promise felt real. They moved into a glass-walled penthouse that overlooked downtown Seattle, a world far removed from the peeling paint and flickering lights of the apartment she had once shared with Daniel. The air smelled of expensive furniture and new beginnings. Every morning, Clara would wake to sunlight spilling through sheer curtains and the low hum of the city below. Ethan was always dressed immaculately, his voice calm and confident, his presence reassuring. He talked about business trips, mergers, clients, and deals worth more than Clara could imagine. For a time, she convinced herself she was happy. She spent her days decorating their home with marble, steel, and art that she didn't quite understand but was told she should appreciate. Her friends envied her, envied the way she could afford to be idle. She hosted brunches where the women compared handbags and whispered about others who weren't invited. Clara smiled at the right moments, sipped her mimosas, and felt her laughter fall flat in her throat. But at night, when the guests left and the house fell quiet, she would stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain slide down the glass. Ethan would often be in his study. On yet another call, his door closed. His voice steady, commanding, would carry through the walls in fragments. She stopped asking who he was talking to. One evening, as she passed his office, she heard laughter. A woman's laughter, soft and private. Clara froze, her hand on the doorframe. When she entered, Ethan looked up, surprised but not startled. The video call ended instantly. "Who was that?" she asked. "A client," he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "You know how some of them get. They think charm makes deals faster." Clara nodded, but her heart didn't believe him. That night she lay awake beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering if he was dreaming of someone else. The city glowed beneath them, an endless web of lights and noise, and yet, in that vastness, Clara felt utterly alone. Days blurred into each other. Ethan's absences grew longer, his excuses more polished. Business in Chicago, a conference in New York. You wouldn't enjoy those meetings, Clara. She stopped arguing. Instead, she filled her time with empty distractions, yoga classes, charity events, lunches that tasted of boredom and guilt. She bought a new dress one afternoon, deep red silk, elegant but daring, and decided to surprise Ethan at a gala he had claimed would be strictly business. When she arrived, the room was a sea of luxury and pretense, the kind of place where smiles were as fragile as glass. Clara spotted Ethan easily. Tall, confident, with that controlled charisma that made people lean toward him. He was speaking to a woman in a black gown, her hand brushing lightly against his arm as she laughed. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She watched for a moment too long before Ethan noticed her. His expression flickered shock, then irritation before he crossed the room with a perfect, public smile. "Clara," he said softly, taking her hand, "you shouldn't have come." Her throat tightened. "Why not?" He leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Because you're making a scene." The words sliced deeper than she expected. He escorted her to a table, smiled for the photographers, then left her sitting alone among glittering strangers. The music swelled, and she realized no one at that table even knew her name. When they returned home that night, they didn't speak. Ethan poured himself a drink and went to his office. Clara stood in the kitchen, the red silk of her dress pooling at her feet as she leaned against the counter, staring at her reflection in the glossy marble. She looked perfect, flawless, composed and completely hollow. Later, she found his phone face down on the table. For the first time, she gave in to the temptation that had haunted her for months. She opened it. There were messages, dozens of them. Names she didn't recognize. Photos she couldn't unsee. Words that left no room for misunderstanding. Her hands trembled as she scrolled, her breath catching in her chest. She had suspected, but seeing it felt like being flayed open. When Ethan came out, his expression was unreadable. "You went through my phone," he said quietly. "You lied to me." He didn't deny it. He only sighed, as if her pain were an inconvenience. "You have everything you ever wanted, Clara. The car, the home, the lifestyle. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She wanted to scream, to throw the glass in her hand against the wall, to make him feel the weight of what he'd done. Instead, she just whispered, "Was any of it real?" Ethan looked at her with something close to pity. It was convenient. That night, she slept in the guest room. She cried quietly, not from heartbreak, but from the dawning realization that she had traded love for comfort and lost both. Weeks passed. They continued the performance for society's sake, smiling at parties, posing for photos, their marriage nothing but a glossy illusion. But inside, Clara was unraveling. The penthouse began to feel like a cage, all glass and reflection, forcing her to confront the emptiness she had built her life around. Sometimes, she found herself scrolling through old photos of Daniel grainy images from simpler days. A park bench, a takeout dinner, a birthday candle in a cupcake. He looked so alive back then, so real. She wondered if he ever thought of her, or if she had become nothing more than a scar he no longer touched. On a rainy afternoon, she stood by the window again, her reflection merging with the gray city beyond. She saw herself not as a woman envied, but as a ghost haunting her own life. Somewhere deep down, the regret began to bloom, not loud, not sudden, but quiet and relentless, like the rain that never stopped falling over Seattle. And though she couldn't admit it yet, part of her already knew. The life she had chosen was cracking, hairline fractures spreading beneath the surface of all that glass and gold. For months after Clara left, Daniel Pierce lived in a kind of stillness that felt heavier than noise. Seattle's rain became his only constant, its rhythm against the windows, its mist clinging to his coat as he walked through the streets that no longer felt familiar. He rented a single room above a bookstore near Capitol Hill, where the scent of paper and dust hung in the air like a kind of comfort. He stopped talking to friends. He stopped answering calls. The world, it seemed, had quietly moved on without him. He worked nights at a local tech repair shop to stay afloat. The pay was small, but the solitude suited him. The hum of machines, the faint glow of monitors, the simple act of fixing what was broken, it gave him something to hold on to. People came in with shattered phones, cracked screens, burnt circuits. He'd work in silence, focused, precise. There was something cleansing about repair. It was predictable, measurable, unlike people, unlike love. But the mind of an engineer never rests. Beneath the grief, beneath the numbness, ideas began to stir again, small sparks in the dark. He started coding at night, using the old laptop he'd managed to save. Not for investors this time, not for validation, just for himself. He wrote programs that solved problems he saw every day, scheduling systems for small businesses, financial trackers for freelancers, interfaces that made complicated things simple. Slowly, the fragments began to form something larger, something that might become real again. He called it Novalink. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to change the world. It was built to make life easier for people who worked alone, people like him, people trying to rebuild. The irony wasn't lost on him. Out of his own brokenness, he was creating something designed to connect others. Daniel didn't talk about his past to anyone, but every line of code carried traces of it. He poured the ache of lost love into the precision of design, the loneliness into clean, efficient architecture. His heartbreak became structure. His regret became discipline. Months turned into a year. Word of his software spread quietly through local tech circles. A small startup incubator invited him to present. He nearly refused, afraid of failure, afraid of hope. But something inside him whispered that maybe this was what healing looked like. On the day of the pitch, he wore a suit borrowed from his neighbor, a man who ran the bookstore downstairs. The sleeves were a little short, the tie too bright, but Daniel looked in the mirror and saw, for the first time in years, someone who still had something left to give. He stood before a small room of investors and began to speak. His voice was steady at first, then stronger. He didn't sell them on dreams of grandeur. He told them the truth. "I built this because I lost everything," he said simply. "And when you lose everything, what you need isn't inspiration, it's structure, connection, a way to start again." There was a silence afterward, heavy but not empty. Then, one of the investors, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward. "You're not selling an app," she said. "Yeah, an app," she said. "You're selling recovery." That afternoon, they offered him seed funding. Novalink grew faster than Daniel had imagined. Within 2 years, it had become a staple tool among freelancers, small companies, and creators across the country. The platform's intuitive design caught the attention of major firms. Soon, acquisitions and partnerships followed. By the time Forbes published an article calling Novalink the next quiet revolution in digital productivity, Daniel had already expanded into San Francisco, managing a small but fiercely loyal team. He worked tirelessly, but his silence remained. The new office overlooked the bay, filled with whiteboards, glass panels, and the quiet buzz of ambition. His employees admired him, his focus, his humility, his relentless calm, but none of them truly knew him. He laughed sometimes, smiled occasionally, but never deeply. Success, he realized, could mask emptiness just as easily as failure exposed it. Still, he built. He built because it was the only language he still spoke fluently. Sometimes, late at night, when the office emptied and the city lights shimmered on the water, Daniel would stand by the window, coffee in hand, and think about the years that had vanished. He never allowed himself to look up Clara's name, though he had the means to. Her memory lived somewhere quiet inside him, not as pain anymore, but as a soft, unspoken scar. It was during one of those long nights that he met Olivia Hart. She was a creative director newly hired to lead Novalink's rebranding campaign. Olivia was sharp, grounded, and unflinchingly direct. She treated Daniel not like a CEO to impress, but like a man who needed reminding that life wasn't just about deadlines and designs. Their first meeting was brief. She challenged his ideas, critiqued his minimalist aesthetic, told him his product was brilliant but emotionally sterile. He laughed a real, unexpected laugh, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir. Over the following months, Olivia became more than a colleague. She had a quiet warmth, a kind of resilience that mirrored his own. She didn't ask about his past, but somehow she understood it. They often worked late together, surrounded by empty coffee cups and half-finished drafts, talking about creativity, purpose, and the strange ache of ambition. One night, as they walked out of the office, Olivia looked at him and said, "You know, you build things like someone who's trying to rebuild himself." Daniel didn't respond right away. He only smiled faintly. "Maybe that's exactly what I'm doing." She nodded, and for a moment, their silence felt like connection rather than loneliness. By the third year, Novalink had gone global. Daniel's name began to circulate in business journals, podcasts, interviews. The boy who'd once been left behind in the rain was now a man whose company was worth hundreds of millions. People called him visionary. He called himself lucky. But in the quiet moments after the applause, after the meetings, he still felt the echo of that night when Clara had walked out. The rain, the silence, the erasure. He often thought success was supposed to erase the past, to rewrite the pain into triumph. But it didn't. It only magnified the truth that even when you build something magnificent, the emptiness beneath the surface doesn't vanish. It simply hides behind glass and light and polished words. Still, Daniel kept building, because in the act of creating, he found a fragile kind of peace, the only peace he could trust. And somewhere, quietly, life was setting the stage for a moment he didn't know was coming. A night when a silver Ferrari would pull up to a hotel entrance, cameras flashing, and he would step out, not as the man she left, but as the man she would no longer recognize. 3 years can turn a life into something unrecognizable. Time had polished the edges of Clara's sorrow into something almost elegant. She had learned how to smile at parties again, how to speak in that careful, airy tone that wealthy wives mastered so easily. Her name appeared in magazines beside Ethan's The Wallaces, patrons of the arts, benefactors of hope. To the world, they were flawless. To her, they were hollow. The gala that evening was held at the Paramount Hotel, one of those old Seattle landmarks restored into modern opulence. The ballroom shimmered beneath golden chandeliers. Waiters moved like choreography through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne and laughter. Music floated above the hum of conversation, the kind that could make loneliness feel almost romantic. Clara wore a gown the color of moonlight. It clung to her shoulders, falling in soft folds that whispered with every step. Diamonds traced the curve of her neck, gifts from a husband who no longer looked her in the eyes. She'd stopped asking where Ethan was most nights. Tonight, she was expected to appear perfect, and she was. But perfection had grown heavy. She stood by a marble column, sipping champagne, pretending to listen to two women discussing gallery investments. Her gaze drifted toward the glass doors that led out to the circular drive where luxury cars glided in and out like silent promises. A silver gleam caught her attention. A Ferrari, sleek and quiet, pulled up beneath the canopy of lights. For a moment, the world seemed to pause the music, the chatter, even her breath. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, composed, the kind of presence that pulled attention without asking for it. When he turned toward the entrance, the light caught his face. Her glass slipped slightly in her hand. It was Daniel. For a heartbeat, she thought she was imagining it, but the certainty settled in her chest like a storm. His hair was shorter now, his frame leaner, his posture surer. He wore a tailored black suit that fit like it had been cut from his own silence. And yet beneath all of that poise, she saw him the man who once fixed broken things in a tiny apartment. The man whose heart she had once held and crushed without realizing it. He walked through the lobby doors with measured ease, his expression calm, eyes scanning the room. The crowd seemed to open for him instinctively, drawn by the quiet authority he carried. The whispers began almost instantly. "That's Daniel Pierce, isn't it? The Novalink founder? They say his company's worth over $1 billion now." Clara felt her pulse quicken. She remembered every word she had thrown at him in anger, every night she'd turned away from him in disappointment. Now, seeing him like this, assured, magnetic, untouched by the ruin she'd left behind, she felt something sharp twist inside her chest. He hadn't seen her yet. At his side was a woman, Olivia Hart, though Clara didn't know her name. She was effortlessly poised, with a confidence that didn't need glitter to shine. Her laughter was soft, her touch on Daniel's arm casual but intimate. Together they looked real, not like the rehearsed perfection Clara had lived within, but like something earned. Across the room, Ethan appeared, shaking hands with a politician, oblivious to her unraveling. Clara's eyes darted between the two men, her husband and her ex-husband, and for the first time, she realized how different they truly were. Ethan's smile was a performance. Daniel's was control born from pain. The event host's voice broke through the music, announcing the start of the auction for the evening. Clara barely heard. Her focus was fixed on Daniel, who had now made his way toward the bar. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the glint of his watch, the way people leaned in slightly when he spoke. He carried himself like someone who had rebuilt his world brick by brick and left no cracks visible. For several minutes, she stayed where she was, torn between pride and panic. Then, something inside her gave way. She moved toward him, each step careful, her heels tapping lightly on the marble floor. The distance between them felt longer than 3 years. When he finally looked up, recognition flickered in his eyes, but no surprise. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. "Clara," he said simply. Her name sounded strange in his voice, deeper, steadier than she remembered. "Daniel," she breathed, unsure what else to say. He offered a small smile, polite but distant. "It's been a long time." "Yes," she said, her throat tightened. "You look different." "So do you." It wasn't cruel, just true. She saw herself reflected in his gaze, the polished woman who had traded warmth for status, laughter for security. She wanted to explain, to tell him that she hadn't meant to destroy what they had, that she'd been scared, that she'd been foolish. But the words tangled inside her. Olivia returned to his side, handing him a drink. Clara forced a smile, her composure trembling. "This is Olivia Hart," Daniel said. "She's our creative director. Olivia, this is Clara." Olivia extended a hand, gracious and kind. "It's nice to meet you." Clara took it, her fingers cold. "You too." Olivia's gaze lingered for a moment, understanding, not judgmental. Then she turned to speak with someone else, leaving Clara and Daniel in a pocket of silence. Clara's voice wavered. "You've done well for yourself." Daniel nodded. "I worked hard." The simplicity of his answer felt heavier than any accusation. A soft laugh escaped her, brittle at the edges. "I always knew you would." He tilted his head slightly. "No, you didn't." That quiet honesty hit harder than anger. Clara felt her breath catch. The music swelled again, a slow orchestral rhythm filling the space between them. "Daniel," she said softly, "I'm sorry." He looked at her, eyes steady, calm, distant. "For what?" "For not believing in you. For everything." He said nothing. His silence was more eloquent than any forgiveness could have been. After a moment, he set his drink down. "Take care of yourself, Clara." And then he walked away back toward Olivia, back toward the light, leaving Clara standing amid the noise and glamour she'd once desired so desperately. She watched him disappear into the crowd, the silver watch on his wrist catching the light one last time. Outside, through the tall glass windows, she could see the Ferrari waiting by the curb, its surface gleaming like liquid silver beneath the rain. For a long moment, she stood there, motionless, her reflection merging with the city beyond the glass. All around her, people laughed, toasted, flirted, danced. The music played on, but inside her, something had gone still. The man she'd mocked for being poor had become everything she once dreamed of, and in doing so, he had become someone she could never touch again. The morning after the gala, Clara woke to a light drizzle tapping against the windows of the penthouse. The city outside looked blurred, washed in gray, as if the night before had been a fever dream she couldn't quite shake off. But the image of Daniel stepping out of that silver Ferrari, calm and unshakable, refused to leave her. His voice, his poise, the distance in his eyes, it replayed in her head like an unfinished song. Ethan was already awake, standing by the kitchen counter in his tailored shirt, scrolling through emails on his phone. His presence filled the room like cold air. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You disappeared early last night," he said. She poured herself a cup of coffee, steadying her hands. "I wasn't feeling well." He glanced up then, eyes narrowing slightly. "You saw him, didn't you?" The spoon stilled in her hand. "Who?" Ethan gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Don't play dumb, Clara. Daniel Pierce was there. Everyone was talking about him." Her pulse quickened, but she forced a calm. "I didn't know he'd be attending." "Did you talk to him?" "Yes," she admitted after a pause. "Briefly." Ethan's jaw tightened. He set his phone down, crossing his arms. "And how was that?" Clara met his gaze, searching for a hint of jealousy, but what she saw instead was calculation, a cold, assessing look, as if her emotions were something to be managed. "He seemed different," she said softly. Ethan snorted. "Different? He's rich now. That's what you mean." The words stung more than she expected. "No, he's changed. He's—" She hesitated. "Not the same man." Ethan's voice turned sharp. "People don't change, Clara. They just get better at pretending." He grabbed his jacket and walked out, leaving her in the stillness of the room. The sound of the door closing echoed through the space like a judgment. Clara stood there for a long while, her coffee growing cold, her reflection wavering in the glass window. For the first time in years, she felt like a stranger in her own life. Later that week, she saw Daniel again. It was at a business luncheon hosted by a local foundation, a networking event Ethan had insisted she attend in his place. "Smile, look elegant, and make sure they remember the Wallace name," he'd said. The luncheon was held at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the bay. White linens, soft jazz, polite laughter. It all felt rehearsed. Clara tried to focus on the small talk around her, but her attention broke the moment Daniel entered the room. He was dressed simply, in a navy suit without a tie. The room shifted subtly when he arrived, as if people adjusted themselves to the quiet gravity he carried. He moved with the ease of a man who no longer needed approval. Their eyes met across the table, a flicker of recognition, then a stillness that felt heavier than sound. He gave her a polite nod before turning to greet another guest. When the speeches ended and the guests mingled, Clara found herself near the balcony, her fingers resting lightly on the railing. The bay below shimmered beneath the afternoon light. She heard footsteps behind her, steady and familiar. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," Daniel said, his voice calm but not cold. She turned, her pulse betraying her composure. "Neither did I. You're everywhere these days." He smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you. The Wallace name has reach." The mention of her husband's name made her chest tighten. "Don't," she said quietly. Daniel's gaze softened. "Still pretending it's the life you wanted?" She looked away, her throat tightening. "You think you know everything about me." "I used to," he said. "Now I'm not sure I know you at all." The silence that followed was thick with things unsaid. Clara wanted to tell him that she'd made a mistake, that every glittering thing around her had turned to dust in her hands, that she'd been haunted by his absence more than she'd ever admit. But his calmness made her feel small, unmoored. He had built something from the ruins she left him in, and she had built walls around herself so high she could barely see out anymore. "I heard about Novalink," she said, desperate to fill the silence. "Everyone has. You've done incredible things." Daniel's expression was unreadable. "Work is easier than feelings. You can fix what's broken in a system. People aren't that simple." She swallowed hard. "You seem happy." He paused, then looked at her with quiet honesty. "Happiness is relative, but I'm at peace." The simplicity of that answer cut through her like a blade. When the event ended, she watched him leave with Olivia again. The other woman's hand brushed his arm, light but certain. Clara felt something ache deep inside her, not jealousy exactly, but a kind of mourning for the version of herself that had once held his trust. That evening, she returned home to find Ethan in the living room, a drink in his hand, the television murmuring stock updates in the background. He looked up briefly. "So how was the luncheon?" She hesitated. "Fine. You saw him again, didn't you?" Her silence was answer enough. Ethan's laugh was sharp. "You think I don't notice the way you look when his name comes up? You forget I know you, Clara." "You don't," she said quietly. "You've never really known me." He stood, closing the distance between them. "You left a man who failed and married me because I didn't. Don't start rewriting history now that he's finally worth something." His words struck hard, raw and unfiltered. Clara flinched. "You think that's all I am to you? A trophy to polish when it suits your image?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You wanted this life. I gave it to you." "No," she said, her voice trembling. "You gave me a cage." The silence that followed was thick, electric. He turned away first, muttering something under his breath, and poured himself another drink. Clara went to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Her reflection in the mirror stared back flawless, unblemished, lifeless. She thought of Daniel's quiet composure, of the steadiness in his eyes, the way he had looked at her without need or bitterness. He had changed. She hadn't. For the first time, she admitted to herself that it wasn't just regret she felt, it was longing. Not for the past, but for the woman she used to be when love still felt real. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the glass, the same rhythm that had followed her for years. And somewhere out there, Daniel Pierce, no longer hers, no longer broken, was driving through the city lights, untouched by the ghosts that still haunted her. The storm that rolled over San Francisco that week felt like an omen. The sky hung heavy and bruised, wind sweeping through the city with a wildness that rattled even the stillest hearts. Clara stood by the window, the faint reflection of her face flickering in the glass, watching raindrops chase one another down. She had grown used to the silence of the penthouse. Its luxury was vast enough to make loneliness echo. But lately, the silence carried a weight, a question pressing against the edges of her mind. What did I really know about the man I married? It began with a whisper. A chance encounter at a charity committee meeting, two women gossiping over espresso martinis. They didn't see Clara approach until the words had already hung in the air. Ethan Wallace didn't just buy out a bankrupt tech firm, one of them said. He orchestrated the collapse. Some small-time startup, what was it called? Oh, right, Pierce Innovations. The name froze Clara mid-step. She felt her heart constrict, as if the room had suddenly lost oxygen. She smiled politely, interjecting before they could notice the tremor in her voice. "Excuse me, Pierce Innovations? That's Daniel's old company, isn't it?" One of the women shrugged. "I think so. My husband mentioned it years ago. Some messy legal thing Ethan got the patent rights, I believe. Typical corporate maneuvering. Nothing personal, of course." Nothing personal. The phrase echoed in her mind long after she left the meeting. By the time she reached the car, her hands were shaking. The rain had started again, slicking the windshield as she sat motionless behind the wheel. Daniel's failure had never made sense to her. Back then, how everything he'd built had crumbled overnight, how investors had vanished, how his bank accounts had been frozen by lawsuits he never saw coming. Ethan had come into her life around that time, smooth and confident, with promises of security and admiration. "You deserve better, Clara. You deserve stability." He'd said it like he was rescuing her. But what if he hadn't been rescuing her at all? That night, she couldn't sleep. Ethan returned, late, smelling faintly of whiskey and rain. His tie was undone, his eyes bloodshot but sharp. "You're still awake?" he asked. She nodded. "I need to ask you something." He loosened his cufflinks and poured himself a drink. "Now?" "Yes. Did you ever have anything to do with Pierce Innovations?" His hand paused mid-pour. The silence that followed was answer enough. She rose from the bed. "Tell me the truth, Ethan." He downed the drink in one swallow, then turned, face composed but eyes cold. "You really want to open that box?" "Yes." He exhaled slowly, setting the glass down. "Fine. Your ex-husband was a dreamer with no structure. He built something he couldn't protect. His company was circling the drain long before I came along. I just expedited the process." Clara's stomach turned. "Expedited? You mean destroyed?" Ethan's voice stayed even. "Business isn't about sentiment. His investors came to me. I saw potential in his prototype, so I made them an offer. I bought them out. It wasn't personal." Her voice cracked. "You took his life's work." "I saved it," Ethan snapped. "Without me, it would have vanished. I had the capital to make it real." She stared at him, disbelief giving way to something deeper, a quiet, shaking fury. "You ruined him. You left him with nothing. Do you understand what that did to him? To us?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "You're welcome, by the way. His failure brought you to me, so in a way, he should thank me." The slap came before she even realized she'd moved. The sound was sharp, echoing off the marble floors. Ethan didn't flinch. He only smiled, a cold, triumphant curve of his lips that made her feel sick. "You think you can shame me?" he said quietly. "You lived off what I gave you. Every dress, every dinner, every vacation you were paid in comfort for your silence." Tears burned her eyes. "I didn't know.
God, I didn't know." "Now you do," he said. "And what are you going to do with it?" He turned away, walking down the hall, leaving her trembling by the fireplace. Days passed, but the truth dug into her like glass. Clara couldn't stop replaying Daniel's calm, unreadable face at the gala, the way he had spoken about rebuilding, about being at peace. He didn't even know. Or did he? She began searching quietly old emails, public records, the fragments of a story that had never been told. And one night, buried beneath legal filings and company mergers, she found it. Novalink Technologies, Ethan's crown jewel, had been built on patents originally registered under Pierce Innovations. Daniel's ideas, his algorithms, his designs hadn't vanished. They'd been reborn under another name, under Ethan Wallace's empire. Clara's breath hitched as she stared at the document. It was all there, the trail of signatures, buyouts, and shell companies. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was theft masked as business. And she had been the bridge that connected them, the unknowing link between the man who created and the man who destroyed. The next morning, she found Ethan in the study, reviewing reports. His cufflinks gleamed under the warm light. "I saw the merger contracts," she said quietly. He didn't look up. So you built Novalink on Daniel's work." He finally met her eyes. "Our work, Clara. Don't forget whose side you're on." She stepped closer. "You stole from him." He smirked. "You really think I'm the first man to take an opportunity? He was naive. I was smart. That's the difference." Her voice trembled. "You destroyed him for profit." Ethan leaned back, his smile thin and tired. "I built an empire for you. And this is how you repay me? With pity for a man who couldn't keep up?" Something broke inside her, then not anger, but clarity. The life she'd built was nothing more than an echo chamber of lies and acquisitions. Every luxury she touched was tainted by the ruin of the man she once loved. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. Ethan's expression hardened. "You think you can walk away from me? After everything?" She turned toward the door. "Watch me." But as she left, she knew the road ahead would not be simple. She carried not only the truth, but the weight of complicity. She had lived on the ashes of Daniel's pain without realizing it. Now, the secret was out, and nothing about their carefully polished world would survive its light. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city glistened, reborn under a thin veil of sunlight. And somewhere across that city, Daniel Pierce lived free of the lies that still bound her. But not for long. The sun had already begun to set when Clara finally gathered the courage to drive to Daniel's office. The city shimmered under the golden haze of evening cars, moved like rivers of light. People hurried home with umbrellas tucked under their arms, and above it all, Novalink's glass tower stood gleaming, reflecting the last traces of day. For 3 nights, she hadn't slept. Her conscience screamed louder with every passing hour, whispering Daniel's name through the silence. Ethan's betrayal had become a mirror she couldn't look away from because in it she saw her own reflection, complicit, blind, cowardly. She didn't expect Daniel to listen. She only needed to tell him the truth, to pull the thorn she had buried in both their hearts 3 years ago. Inside the building, everything was quiet and sterile steel, glass, and soft light. The receptionist recognized her immediately, her professional smile faltering. "Mrs. Wallace, Mr. Pierce is still in a meeting." Clara clasped her trembling hands. "I'll wait." She sat in the lobby for nearly an hour. Her reflection in the polished floor looked like that of a stranger, too perfect, too controlled, too hollow. When the office door finally opened and Daniel stepped out, her heart nearly gave way. He looked surprised to see her, more than surprised, guarded. "Clara," he said softly,
as if saying her name summoned something he had long buried. "I need to talk to you," she whispered. He studied her for a moment, then nodded and gestured toward his private office. The room was quiet, the hum of the city faint through the windows. Clara stood near the corner, unable to meet his eyes. Daniel moved behind his desk but didn't sit. "What is it you want?" His tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't welcoming either. "I found out the truth," she said, "about what happened to Pierce Innovations." He froze. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a mix of pain and exhaustion. "Go on." "It wasn't your fault," she continued, her voice cracking. "Ethan was behind it. He orchestrated the buyouts, the lawsuits, everything. He stole your work. He built Novalink on your technology." Daniel's silence was heavy. He looked at her as though the words were physical objects he had to hold in his hands to believe. Finally, he spoke. "I knew." Clara's breath hitched. "You knew?" He nodded slowly. "I found out a year ago. My lawyers traced the patents back. I didn't need confirmation." Her heart twisted. "Then why didn't you?" "What would it have changed?" His voice was calm, too calm. "Would it have given me back those nights I slept on the floor of my empty apartment, wondering why everything I touched fell apart? Would it have erased the image of you standing beside him at the press conference, the man who destroyed me, smiling like you belonged there?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't know, Daniel. I swear I didn't know." He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. When he spoke again, his tone had softened. "Maybe not, but you didn't want to know either." The words cut through her like glass. She took a step closer, desperate. "I came here because I can't live with it anymore. I can't live with what he did to you, to us. I left him." Daniel's eyes lifted, searching hers. "You left him?" She nodded. "Last night, I walked out." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was alive with memories of late-night takeout boxes, whispered dreams, fights that ended in tears, and the love that had once made the world seem small and infinite all at once. "Clara," he said finally, his voice rough, "what do you want from me?" She swallowed hard. "Forgiveness." Daniel turned away, looking out the window. The city lights painted his reflection in the glass, fractured and luminous. "Forgiveness isn't something you demand, Clara. It's something you earn. And sometimes," he paused, "you never do." Her tears fell silently now. "I'm not asking you to take me back. I just need you to know how sorry I am." He faced her again, and for the first time, the wall between them began to tremble. "You think I haven't imagined this moment?" he said quietly. 100 times I thought of what I'd say to you, how I'd tell you I hated you, that I'd moved on, that your absence made me stronger. But the truth is, I don't hate you, Clara. I hate the part of me that still remembers loving you." Her breath broke. "Daniel." He shook his head, stepping back. "Do you have any idea what it was like? Watching you choose him, watching you believe I wasn't enough, that I was just another man with dreams too small to keep you safe?" "I was scared," she whispered. "I thought stability meant love. I thought success could erase failure, but it only erased me." Daniel exhaled slowly, his anger dissolving into something more fragile. "You were never just a part of my story, Clara. You were the whole thing. And when you left, I didn't rebuild my life, I replaced it, because it hurt too much to remember what it used to be." She took another step closer. "Then let this be the last time I hurt you. Take what's yours, Daniel. The patents, the credit, everything Ethan stole. Expose him. You deserve that." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment she saw the man she once knew, the quiet strength, the compassion that always softened his edges.
And what happens to you if I do? I don't care, she said. Maybe I should finally pay for what I ignored. Daniel turned away again, pacing slowly. His jaw tightened as he thought, torn between anger and the ghost of empathy. Finally, he spoke. I don't want revenge, Clara. I just want peace, and exposing him won't give me that. It'll just drag me back into a war I already escaped. She stared at him, her heart sinking. So you'll let him get away with it? He met her gaze. No, I'll let myself get away from both of you. There was no cruelty in his voice, only a quiet finality. Clara felt the truth settle between them like dust. She nodded, tears spilling freely now. Then I'll go. As she reached for the door, he spoke again, softer this time. Clara. She turned. For what it's worth, he said, I believe you didn't mean to hurt me, but belief doesn't undo what's been done. Her lips trembled. I know. He didn't stop her when she left. The door closed with a soft click, leaving him alone in the vast, quiet office. Daniel sank into his chair, staring out at the skyline. He felt no triumph, no relief, only the dull ache of something too long suppressed. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't a decision. It was a process, a slow unwinding of the heart. And though he couldn't yet forgive her, a part of him buried deep in trembling wanted to try. The rain had returned to San Francisco that night heavy, relentless, the kind that soaked through every layer and made the whole city feel like it was exhaling something long held back. The streets shimmered under the flicker of traffic lights, reflections, rippling in puddles like restless ghosts. Clara stood beneath the awning of a quiet cafe near the Embarcadero, her coat clutched tightly around her, her breath clouding in the cold. She had asked him to meet her one last time. She didn't know if he would come, but some part of her still believed he would because Daniel Pierce had always been the kind of man who finished what others left undone. She heard the low hum. Before she saw it, the silver Ferrari gliding through the mist, headlights cutting through the curtain of rain. The sight of it made her chest tighten. It wasn't envy this time. It was memory. The same man she had once loved had walked through fire to become this version of himself. And she had burned bridges she could never rebuild. When Daniel stepped out of the car, he looked almost unreal in the stormlight dark coat, wet hair clinging to his forehead, his presence both quiet and commanding. He spotted her immediately. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then he walked toward her. Clara, he said, his voice calm but weighted with something deeper. She managed a faint, trembling smile. You came. I said I would, he replied simply. They stepped inside the cafe, where the faint jazz of an old radio filled the small space. The barista, recognizing Daniel, pretended not to listen as they found a corner table by the window. Outside, the rain streaked the glass like tears neither could shed. I didn't think you'd want to see me again, she said, her voice almost lost in the hum of the rain. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. I wasn't sure I did, but I realized I didn't want to leave things unfinished. She nodded slowly. Neither did I. There was a pause, the kind that felt like both a wound and a balm. I've filed for divorce, Clara said quietly. From Ethan. I've given my lawyers everything, emails, contracts, the proof of what he did to you. It'll come out soon. Daniel's gaze flickered toward the window, where neon light washed across the rain-streaked glass. You don't have to do that for me. I'm not, she whispered. I'm doing it for myself. For the first time in years, I want to look in the mirror and not see someone pretending to be whole. He said nothing for a while. The rain filled the silence between them. Then, with quiet deliberation, he reached for his cup and took a sip of coffee that had long gone cold. You always said you hated rain, he murmured. I used to, she said, smiling faintly. Now I think it's the only thing honest left in this city. It doesn't pretend." Daniel looked at her again, and for the first time that evening, his eyes softened. There was no bitterness left in them, only a kind of weary understanding. "You're not the same person anymore," he said. "Neither are you," she replied, "and maybe that's a good thing." He nodded, his gaze lowering to the table, where his fingers traced the rim of his cup. "I spent a long time wanting you to regret what you did," he said quietly. "I thought it would make things easier, but it didn't. It just kept me chained to the past." Clara's throat tightened. "Do you hate me?" He shook his head. "No, I did once, but hate is just love that's been starved too long. It burns out eventually." A tear slipped down her cheek, uninvited, unhidden. "Then what's left?" Daniel's eyes lifted to hers. "Peace, if you let it." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they'd lived through. For a long while, they sat in silence, the sound of rain the only witness to their quiet reckoning. Clara wanted to reach across the table, to hold his hand the way she used to, but she knew that gesture belonged to another life, one that had already ended. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you for coming, for listening. I didn't expect forgiveness." Daniel's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "It's not forgiveness yet, but it's a beginning." She nodded, and her tears came freely now, not of grief, but of something gentler. Release. When they finally stood, the storm outside had softened to a drizzle. The city was quiet, washed clean. Daniel walked her to the door, his steps measured, his presence steady. The silver Ferrari waited by the curb, its surface glistening under the streetlights. As they stepped out into the rain, Clara noticed the woman in the passenger seat, Olivia. Her hair was damp, her expression patient, calm. She gave Clara a polite nod when their eyes met. There was no jealousy, no triumph, just quiet knowing. Clara turned to Daniel. "She's good for you," she said softly. He didn't deny it. "She found me when I stopped looking for anyone." "Then don't lose her," Clara said. He smiled, a real one this time. "I don't plan to." They stood there for a moment, two people who had loved, lost, and finally learned what it meant to let go. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking on the edges. "Goodbye, Clara," he replied, his tone steady, but his eyes glistening. He stepped into the car, the engine humming to life. As the Ferrari pulled away, Clara watched the red taillights blur into the rain, fading like a heartbeat in the distance. She stood there until the sound disappeared, the rain soft against her face, washing everything clean, the guilt, the lies, the weight of years. She turned to the cafe window and caught her reflection in the glass. For the first time in so long, she didn't look away. The woman staring back at her looked older, softer, and painfully real, but she was still standing, still breathing, still capable of change, and maybe that was redemption, not being forgiven by another, but forgiving oneself. The rain continued to fall, steady and endless, like truth itself washing the city, washing her, leaving behind only what could finally endure.